In the blizzard of the century, when the professional search and rescue team is forced to admit defeat, the last hope of saving a boy buried alive rests in the hands of a reclusive veteran. But there's a cruel twist no one knows. The mountain pass where the boy vanished is the very same place Aaron's family was buried years earlier, during a storm identical in every detail. Now, to save a life, he must lead Storm, the very dog he rescued, and walk back into that living tomb of memory himself. This is no longer a rescue mission. It's a confrontation between one man, his loyal dog, and the ghosts that have never let him go. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence in the mountains around Aspen Ridge had a weight to it, a physical presence that pressed in on all sides. For Aaron Blake, it was both a sanctuary and a prison. His log cabin, tucked away on a high slope overlooking the valley, was more fortress than home, its sturdy pine walls built to keep the world out and his ghosts in. At 43, Aaron wore the landscape of his past on his face. He was a tall man, lean in the way of someone whose strength was forged from necessity rather than vanity. His short brown hair was streaked with silver at the temples, a premature gray that spoke of things seen and endured. A rugged beard, more salt than pepper, covered a jaw that was perpetually tight, and his eyes, a deep shade of slate blue, held a permanent storm in their depths. They were the eyes of a former Special Forces soldier, trained to see everything but revealing nothing. Today, he wore his usual cold-weather uniform, an old, unzipped brown leather jacket that had long since molded to his frame, a faded plaid shirt in shades of navy, and beige underneath, worn denim jeans, and a pair of heavy work boots that had trampled miles of unforgiving terrain. His life was a meticulously constructed routine, a series of repetitive physical tasks designed to occupy his hands and exhaust his body, leaving little room for his mind to wander into the treacherous territory of memory. Mornings began before sunrise. The sharp, rhythmic crack of his axe splitting firewood was often the first sound to break the mountain's hush. He would stack the wood with methodical precision, each log placed just so, creating neat, towering walls that fortified his solitude. After the wood, he would embark on a long, punishing hike, pushing his body up steep, unmarked trails until his lungs burned and his muscles screamed in protest. He never walked the same path twice in a week, a habit ingrained from a life where predictability could be a death sentence. He avoided the small town of Aspen Ridge whenever possible. The forced pleasantries, the well-meaning questions from the few locals who remembered him from before were like sandpaper on a raw wound. He bought his supplies in bulk, timing his trips for quiet weekday afternoons when the general store was least likely to be crowded. He would nod curtly at the cashier, pay in cash, and retreat back to his mountain fortress before the quiet sympathy in their eyes could breach his defenses. The isolation was his shield. Out here, there was only the wind sighing through the pines, the cry of a distant hawk, and the steady, reliable rhythm of the seasons. It was a clean, uncomplicated existence, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of his former life and the deafening silence that had followed. The accident had happened 5 years ago, but for Aaron, it was a constant, looping present. It wasn't the jagged memories of his time in the service that haunted him most, but the crystalline, perfect clarity of that one snowy night. The slick mountain road, the blinding headlights of the oncoming truck, the sickening crunch of metal, and the sudden absolute silence that came after. He had survived, pulled from the wreckage with nothing more than broken ribs and a shattered soul. His wife, Sarah, and their 7-year-old daughter, Lily, had not. Guilt was a living thing inside him, a cold, heavy creature that had taken up residence where his heart used to be. The what-ifs were his relentless tormentors. What if he had driven slower? What if they had left an hour earlier? What if he had just stayed home? Each question was a fresh turn of the knife. He, the soldier trained to protect, the man who had faced down enemy fire in desolate foreign lands, had failed in the one mission that truly mattered. He couldn't protect his own family. So he retreated, turning his back on the world that kept spinning without them. His life became an act of penance, a quiet, self-imposed exile. He existed, he functioned, he breathed, but he did not live. Today, a change was in the air. A cold wind, sharp and biting, swept down from the highest peaks, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of snow. It was the first true blast of winter, a harbinger of the long, harsh months to come. The sky, a brilliant, cloudless blue that morning, had slowly veiled itself in a uniform sheet of pearl gray. Aaron was outside, finishing his woodpile, when the first flake landed on the back of his hand. It was delicate and perfect, a tiny fleeting star that melted almost instantly against his skin. Then came another, and another. Within minutes, the air was thick with a soft, silent flurry. He stopped, axe held loosely in his hand, and watched as the world around him began to transform. The dark green of the pines softened under a dusting of white. The brown, dormant earth slowly disappeared beneath a pristine blanket. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. But for Aaron, the beauty was a cruel deception. The sight of the falling snow was not a gentle prelude to winter. It was a trigger. The air grew colder, but the chill that seized him came from within. The soft, sound-dampening quality of the snowfall did not bring peace. It brought back the terrible, echoing silence of the crash. His breath hitched in his chest. The carefully constructed walls of his routine began to crumble. The image of the mangled car, half buried in a snowdrift, flashed behind his eyes, vivid and unwelcome. He could almost hear the faint, phantom sound of Lily's laughter from earlier that day, a sound that now felt like a shard of glass in his memory. He dropped the axe. It fell with a dull thud into the rapidly accumulating snow. His hands began to tremble, a tremor that started in his fingertips and worked its way up his arms. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images only grew brighter, more insistent. The red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles pulsing against the white snow. The hollow, detached voice of the state trooper, the small unicorn mitten he had found on the floor of the back seat. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. He stumbled back, bracing himself against the rough logs of his cabin. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The silent, falling snow felt like it was suffocating him, each flake a tiny particle of his unbearable past descending to bury him alive. He was no longer on his mountain. He was back on that dark, icy road, trapped in the single moment that had destroyed everything. The silence of the snow was screaming, and Aaron Blake, the soldier who had survived so much, was on the verge of breaking. The scream died in Aaron's throat before it could ever form. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to physically push back the torrent of images. The cold from the logs at his back seeped through his jacket, a grounding chill that pulled him inch by painful inch from the precipice of memory. He took a ragged breath, then another. The panic was receding, leaving behind the familiar hollow ache of grief. He couldn't stay out here. The snow was falling faster now, heavier, beginning to stick to his hair and beard. He needed to get inside, back to the sterile safety of his routine. But as he stood, a more practical, urgent thought cut through the fog. Supplies. He was running low on essentials, and this snowstorm, the first of the season, looked like it was settling in for the long haul. If he got snowed in, it could be days, maybe a week, before he could get his old truck down the mountain pass. The thought of driving into town, of potential human interaction, was repellent. But the thought of being trapped up here with dwindling supplies was worse. It was a choice between two evils, and he chose the one that was quickest to resolve. With a grimace, he brushed the snow from his shoulders, grabbed the fallen axe, and headed for the small shed that served as his garage. His truck, a late 1990s Ford F-150, was a beast of a machine, rust-colored and dented, but with a reliable engine that had never let him down. It started with a protesting roar that ripped through the quiet air. He navigated the winding, unpaved track from his cabin down to the secondary mountain road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the thick, wet flakes. Visibility was shrinking by the minute. The familiar landscape transformed into a ghostly, indistinct world of white and gray. He was less than a mile from the main paved road when it happened. Coming around a sharp blind curve, he hit a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. The back end of the truck fishtailed wildly. Aaron corrected, his soldier's instincts kicking in, but the momentum was too much. The heavy vehicle slid sideways, its front tires dipping into the deep, snow-filled ditch along the side of the road. With a final, jarring lurch, the truck settled at an awkward angle, its rear wheel spinning uselessly, digging itself deeper into the snow. Aaron slammed his fist on the steering wheel, a rare outburst of frustration. He tried rocking the truck back and forth, but it was no use. He was thoroughly stuck. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the falling snow and the mournful howl of the wind as it whipped through the aspen groves. He sat for a moment, letting the cold reality sink in. He was alone, stranded, with a long walk back to his cabin in a worsening storm. He sighed, a plume of white vapor in the frigid air, and was about to open the door when he heard it. It was a faint sound, high-pitched and thin, almost indistinguishable from the wind. A whimper. He froze, listening intently. It came again, a desperate, wavering cry that was abruptly cut short. He told himself it was just an animal, a fox or a coyote, and it was none of his business. He had his own problems. But the sound had a note of suffering in it that resonated with something deep inside him. He pushed open the heavy truck door and stepped out into the knee-deep snow. The cold was immediate and sharp. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding rough from disuse. Only the wind answered. Then he heard it again, closer this time. It was coming from off the road, somewhere in the dense stand of trees. Against his better judgment, he began to push his way through the snow, following the sound. The going was tough, each step a struggle against the clinging drifts. He found the source 50 yards into the woods. At the base of a large ponderosa pine lay a creature that was little more than a shivering heap of gray and white fur. It was a German shepherd, young, probably no more than 2 or 3 years old. Its magnificent coat, a blend of silver, charcoal, and cream, was matted with ice and dirt. Its body was racked with violent tremors, and its intelligent, almond-shaped eyes were glazed with pain and exhaustion. Then Aaron saw the cause. The dog's front left leg was trapped in the savage jaws of a bear trap. It was an old, wicked-looking thing, rusted from years of exposure to the elements, and its metal teeth had bitten deep into the dog's limb, just above the paw. The snow around the trap was stained a sickening, dark crimson. Aaron's training took over. He knelt, his mind shifting into the clinical, detached mode that had served him so well in the field. He examined the injury with a practiced eye. The flesh was torn, the muscle mangled. It was a devastating wound. But as he gently felt along the leg, his gloved fingers probing with surprising care, he realized with a surge of relief that the bone, while surely damaged, did not feel shattered. It wasn't crushed. There was a chance, however slim, that the leg could be saved. He looked from the mangled leg to the dog's face. The animal didn't growl or snap. It just lay there, its breathing shallow, and let out another low, pitiful whimper. And in its eyes, Aaron saw it. He saw the same exhaustion, the same pain, the same sense of being trapped by a cruel, indifferent fate that he saw in his own reflection every morning. He saw a fellow survivor, hanging on by a thread. In that moment, something shifted inside him. It was not a conscious decision born of pity or kindness. Aaron Blake had little of that left to give. It was a deeper, more primal impulse. It was the visceral recognition of one broken soul acknowledging another. To turn his back on this creature would be to turn his back on the last, flickering ember of his own humanity. To leave this dog to die in the snow would be to admit that his own quiet death of the spirit was complete. He would not let that happen. "Okay," he whispered, the word a rough rasp in his throat. "Okay, I got you." He worked quickly and methodically. Using a fallen branch as a lever and summoning every ounce of his strength, he began to pry the rusty jaws of the trap apart. The dog yelped, a sharp cry of agony, but it didn't struggle. It seemed to understand. With a final groaning screech of metal, the trap released its hold. Aaron gently freed the mangled paw. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his worn leather jacket and wrapped it carefully around the shivering dog. He lifted the animal into his arms. It was lighter than it should have been, a testament to a long period of starvation. The dog let out a soft sigh and rested its head against his chest, a gesture of absolute trust that struck Aaron with a force he hadn't felt in years. He didn't even glance back at the stranded truck. It didn't matter anymore. Turning, he began the long, arduous walk back to his cabin, carrying his new, fragile burden through the heart of the storm. The walk back to the cabin was a brutal, timeless ordeal. Each step was a plunge into the deep, resisting snow, the wind a physical force that tore at Aaron's exposed face and stole the air from his lungs. The weight in his arms was a strange combination of dead weight and fragile life. He held the dog tight against his chest, shielding it as best he could with his own body, the animals shivering a constant, desperate vibration against his ribs. He focused on one thing only: the next step. It was a familiar mindset, a mantra from his past life. Just one more step, then another. He finally stumbled onto his porch, kicking the door open and collapsing inside into a heap of snow and exhaustion. The warmth of the cabin was a welcome shock. He gently laid the dog down on the worn bearskin rug in front of the stone fireplace, the animal's body limp, its breathing shallow. For a moment, it didn't move, and a cold spear of fear lanced through Aaron. He quickly placed a hand on its chest and felt the faint, thready beat of its heart. Relief washed over him, swift and surprisingly potent. His training kicked into high gear, pushing aside his exhaustion. First, fire. He added logs to the embers, coaxing them back to life until a roaring blaze filled the hearth, casting flickering orange light across the rustic room. Then, the wound. He fetched his old military medic kit from a dusty footlocker, its contents neatly organized and still functional. He worked with a surgeon's precision. He carefully cut away the matted, blood-caked fur around the injury, revealing the true extent of the damage. The trap's teeth had ripped through flesh and muscle, leaving a gruesome, gaping wound. But his initial assessment in the woods had been correct. The bone was intact. He cleaned the wound meticulously with boiled water and the last of his antiseptic wipes, his hands steady despite the grisly task. The dog flinched and whimpered, its eyes wide with pain, but it made no move to bite or struggle. It seemed to understand on some primal level that this pain was a necessary part of a rescue it had long since given up on. Using a suture needle and thread from his kit, Aaron began to stitch the wound closed. His large, calloused hands that had assembled rifles and navigated hostile terrain, moved with an astonishing delicacy. Each stitch was a small, focused act of repair, a stark contrast to the destruction that had defined so much of his life. As he worked, the cabin was silent save for the crackling of the fire and the dog's soft, pained breathing. In this bubble of concentration, the ghosts of his past receded. There was no room for guilt or memory, only for the immediate, tangible mission of saving this life. When he was finished, he fashioned a crude but effective splint from a piece of kindling and strips of a clean t-shirt, immobilizing the leg to allow it to heal. He covered the dog with a thick wool blanket, then sat back on his heels, a deep weariness settling into his bones. He knew this was only the first step. The risk of infection was high, and he needed proper medical supplies, stronger antiseptics, antibiotics if he could get them. The thought made him grimace. There was only one person nearby who might have such things, a person he had actively avoided for years. Martha Hayes lived about 2 miles down the mountain in a small, tidy cabin that was the only other sign of human life in his immediate vicinity. She was a retired park ranger, a woman in her late 60s who was as much a part of the mountain as the ancient pines themselves. She was short and wiry, with a face mapped by sun and wind and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Aaron had encountered her a few times on the trails over the years, and their interactions had always been the same. a brief, polite nod before he would alter his course to avoid conversation. Martha, in turn, had always respected his silent request for solitude. Going to her now felt like a defeat, an admission that he couldn't handle things on his own. It was a breach of the unwritten rules of his exile. But when he looked at the dog, its life hanging in the balance, he knew his pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. He pulled on a spare coat, gritted his teeth against the still raging storm, and set out. The journey to Martha's cabin was even worse than the walk back from the truck. The snow was deeper, the wind more vicious. By the time he saw the welcoming yellow light of her window, he was half frozen and drained of all energy. He knocked on her door, the sound unnaturally loud in the storm. After a moment, the door opened. Martha Hayes stood there, a book in one hand, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans. She didn't look surprised to see him, only concerned. "Aaron," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Get in here before you freeze to death." He stepped inside, bringing a swirl of snow with him. Her cabin was the opposite of his, warm, cluttered, and filled with the comforting smell of wood smoke and vegetable soup. Books were stacked on every available surface, and maps of the surrounding wilderness adorned the walls. "I need help," he said, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "I found a dog, caught in a trap. Its leg is in bad shape. I need antiseptic. Anything you have to fight infection." Martha didn't ask where or how. She simply nodded, her gaze assessing his soaked clothes and exhausted state. "Of course. Let me see what I've got. I keep a pretty extensive first aid kit for the animals around here." She disappeared into a back room and returned with a well-stocked medical box. She gave him a bottle of iodine, a tube of antibiotic ointment, and a roll of clean, sterile gauze. "This should help," she said, placing the items into a small canvas bag. Then she turned to the stove, where a large pot was simmering. "You're not walking back up that mountain on an empty stomach." Before he could protest, she ladled a generous portion of thick, hearty vegetable soup into a large thermal container. "Here," she said, pressing it into his hands. "And take this. For your patient." She added a small foil-wrapped package that, by its smell, contained cooked chicken. Aaron stood there, motionless, holding the bag of medical supplies and the warm container of soup. It was the first act of direct, unconditional kindness he had received, or allowed himself to receive, in 5 years. It disarmed him completely. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "No need," Martha replied, her eyes softening with a wisdom that went far beyond his immediate situation. "We all need a little help sometimes. Now get back home before that fire of yours goes out." He nodded, unable to say more, and stepped back out into the storm. The walk back was just as hard, but this time he didn't feel as alone. Back in his cabin, he found the dog awake. Its eyes followed him as he unwrapped the supplies. He gently treated the wound again with the proper medicine, then offered the dog a small piece of the chicken from Martha. The dog sniffed it tentatively, then ate it with a quiet hunger. Later, as the storm continued to rage outside, Aaron sat in his worn armchair, the thermal container of soup warming his hands. The dog slept soundly on the rug, its breathing deeper and more regular now. For the first time in years, the silence in the cabin wasn't empty or menacing. It was filled with the soft breathing of another living creature. And as Aaron ate the soup, a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the food or the fire. It was the faint, fragile flicker of a connection he thought had been extinguished forever. The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived. Morning dawned clear and cold, the world outside Aaron's cabin transformed into a silent, pristine sculpture of white. The sun, a pale disk in the winter sky, cast long blue shadows across the snow, and the air was so crisp it felt sharp in the lungs. For the first time in 5 years, the aftermath of a snowstorm did not fill Aaron with a paralyzing sense of dread. Instead, there was a quiet, unfamiliar sense of purpose. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, a routine dictated not by the rigid demands of Aaron's grief, but by the needs of the living creature that now shared his solitude. The process of healing was slow and deliberate, a quiet two-way street of care and recovery. Every morning and evening, Aaron would gently unwrap the bandage on the dog's leg. He would clean the wound with the iodine Martha had given him, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were mapped with the scars of a harder life. He would redress it with fresh gauze, his movements economical and precise. He learned the subtle language of the dog's pain, a slight tensing of a muscle, a soft whine, a quickening of breath. And he learned to adjust his touch, to be slower, more careful. This focus was an anchor. The dog's needs were immediate, tangible, and real. It needed food, it needed water, its wound needed tending. These simple, undeniable facts pushed back against the insidious whisper of memory. He couldn't afford to get lost in the past when the present required his full attention. He named him Storm. The name came to him one afternoon as he watched the dog sleep by the fire. He had appeared out of the heart of the blizzard, a whirlwind of pain and desperation that had breached the walls of Aaron's quiet life. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the chaos that had brought them together. The name felt right. As Aaron tended to Storm's physical wounds, Storm, in his own silent way, began to tend to Aaron's. The heavy, oppressive silence of the cabin was now filled with the soft sounds of another being. The quiet panting, the occasional sigh in sleep, the click of claws on the wooden floor. Aaron found himself speaking aloud, not in conversation, but in quiet, one-sided observations. "Time for your medicine," he would murmur, or, "Looks like the fire needs another log." The words were for himself as much as for the dog, a way of relearning the sound of his own voice in a space that had been silent for too long. Slowly, agonizingly, Storm began to heal. The first time he put the slightest pressure on his injured leg was a milestone. A week later, he took a hesitant three-legged step from the rug to his water bowl. Each pained, limping movement was a victory, and Aaron watched with an investment he hadn't felt in anything for years. He saw the dog's grit, its stubborn will to survive, and he felt a flicker of something akin to admiration. Every one of Storm's tentative steps forward was a step Aaron himself took away from the wreckage on that icy road, a small but significant movement out of the frozen landscape of his grief. The true breakthrough came several weeks later. The snow had settled, and a fragile winter sun offered a pale, watery warmth. Storm's leg, though still wrapped, was much stronger. He could now move about the cabin with a pronounced but steady limp. Aaron was sitting on his porch steps, cleaning a hunting knife, his mind drifting into that familiar gray space between present and past. Storm limped out of the open cabin door, a small, dry pine branch held carefully in his mouth. He approached Aaron and dropped the branch near his boots. Aaron glanced at it, then went back to his knife, assuming the dog was simply chewing on it. Storm nudged the branch with his nose, pushing it closer until it touched the toe of Aaron's boot. He then looked up at Aaron, his intelligent eyes expectant. Aaron paused, a flicker of annoyance giving way to curiosity. He put down the knife and picked up the branch. It felt light and insignificant in his hand. On a strange impulse, he tossed it a few feet away into a bank of soft snow. Storm's reaction was immediate. He bounded after it, his limp more pronounced with the sudden movement, and plunged his head into the snow. He emerged a moment later, branch held triumphantly, and trotted back to Aaron. He dropped it again at his feet, and this time, something incredible happened. His tail, which had been held low and still since the day Aaron found him, gave a single, slow, tentative wag. Then another. The sight struck Aaron with the force of a physical blow. A wagging tail. It was such a simple, ordinary thing, a universal expression of canine joy. But in the context of his silent, joyless world, it was an earth-shattering event. It was a sign of trust, of contentment, of a life that was not just surviving, but beginning to live again. A complex knot of emotions tightened in Aaron's chest. Surprise, confusion, and something else, something warm and unfamiliar that felt dangerously like hope. He couldn't remember the last time he had witnessed an act of simple, uncomplicated happiness. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a faint, rusty movement of muscles long dormant. He picked up the branch and threw it again. The need for supplies eventually became unavoidable, but this time the list included a new essential item: dog food. The trip to Aspen Ridge felt different. He still felt the familiar reluctance to face the town, but it was overlaid with a new sense of mission. He wasn't just going for himself. The general store was quiet, just as he liked it. He gathered his own provisions quickly, then spent an inordinate amount of time in the small pet aisle, reading the ingredients on bags of kibble with a seriousness he usually reserved for checking his gear. He finally settled on a brand, hoisted the heavy bag onto his shoulder, and headed for the checkout. As he was leaving the store, a new-looking SUV pulled into the parking spot next to his truck. A family began to unload groceries. The Sullivans. He knew they were new to town. Small-town gossip traveled on the wind, and even Aaron couldn't avoid hearing all of it. The father was a man about his own age, with a weary but kind face. The mother was trying to orchestrate the unloading with a strained patience. And then there was the son. Noah Sullivan was a study in teenage discontent. He was probably 15, tall and gangly, swallowed by a dark gray hoodie with the hood pulled up. A pair of expensive headphones were slung around his neck, a clear signal that he was tuned into a different world. He moved with a sullen lethargy, his face a mask of boredom and resentment as he grabbed a bag from the back of the car. He clearly did not want to be here. As Noah turned, he fumbled the bag he was holding. A carton of eggs and a bunch of celery tumbled out onto the wet pavement. "For goodness sake, Noah," his mother sighed, her patience fraying. Before he could stop himself, Aaron stepped forward. He bent down and picked up the celery, handing it to the boy. Noah looked up, surprised, his hood falling back to reveal a face full of youthful frustration. "Thanks," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "No problem," Aaron replied, his voice a low rumble. He gave a short nod to the boy's father and turned to his truck. But as he drove away, the image of the boy's face stayed with him. He saw the anger, the confusion, the chafing against parental authority. He saw the awkwardness of a boy on the cusp of manhood, trapped in a small town he didn't choose. And in that moment, a profound and hollow sadness washed over Aaron. He was seeing a ghost of a future he would never have. He would never have these arguments with Lily. He would never see her through her own teenage angst, navigate the choppy waters of her first heartbreak, or watch with a mix of pride and fear as she grew into the woman she was meant to be. All those messy, complicated, beautiful moments had been stolen from him. The drive back up the mountain was quiet. The sadness was a familiar weight, but it was different this time. It was tinged with the memory of a wagging tail. When he pulled up to his cabin, Storm was waiting on the porch, his head cocked, his body alert. He let out a single, sharp bark of welcome. And Aaron Blake, for the first time in 5 years, felt like he was coming home. The feeling of coming home was a fragile, tentative thing, a seedling pushing its way through frozen ground. In the weeks that followed his trip to Aspen Ridge, Aaron guarded it fiercely. The new routine, once dictated solely by Storm's needs, now felt less like a duty and more like a shared existence. Their days were quiet, marked by the simple rituals of mountain life. Aaron would chop wood, and Storm, his leg now healed enough to bear his full weight, would lie nearby, watching with his intelligent eyes, occasionally letting out a soft sigh. They took short, slow walks along the snow-packed trails, Storm's limp a subtle reminder of the ordeal that had brought them together. Aaron found himself observing the world again, not just seeing it. He noticed the way the winter sunlight filtered through the bare aspen trees, creating a lattice of gold on the snow. He heard the distinct call of a Steller's jay, a flash of brilliant blue against the white landscape. These were things he had been blind and deaf to for 5 years, his senses dulled by the static of his grief. Storm was his guide back to the present, his quiet presence a constant grounding force. The peace, however, was borrowed time. Winter in the Rockies is a relentless beast, and one afternoon, the weather radio crackled to life with a new warning. A major system was moving in from the west, a blizzard expected to bring heavy snow and dangerously high winds, far more severe than the first storm of the season. The announcement sent a jolt of cold, familiar dread through Aaron's veins. He tried to rationalize it. He was prepared. He had ample firewood, enough food for himself and Storm for weeks. He was not the same man who had been caught unawares 5 years ago. This time was different. But trauma is not rational. It is a phantom limb, an ache for something that is gone, a pain that can flare up with the slightest change in atmospheric pressure. As the sky began to darken, turning a bruised, ominous shade of gray, Aaron felt the old anxiety coiling in his gut. He busied himself checking the seals on the windows, bringing in an extra load of firewood, his movements sharp and jerky. Storm sensed the change in him immediately. The dog, who had been dozing by the fire, rose and followed him around the cabin, his body language a mirror of Aaron's tension, his ears twitching at every gust of wind. When the first flakes began to fall, they were small and dry, skittering across the porch like grains of sand. But within the hour the storm descended with a terrifying ferocity. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful cry that escalated into a shrieking, violent roar. It sounded like a freight train, a sound Aaron remembered with sickening clarity. The snow was no longer falling. It was a horizontal, blinding wall of white, erasing the world outside his windows. Aaron stood in the center of the room, his breath catching in his chest. The roar of the wind, the sight of the swirling, impenetrable white. It was the same. It was the night of December 12, 2019, all over again. The cabin walls seemed to melt away, and he was back in the truck, the steering wheel slick with sweat beneath his hands. Sarah was beside him, her voice a low, worried murmur as she looked at the road ahead. "Maybe we should have waited until morning, Aaron." "We'll be fine," he had said, his voice laced with a confidence he didn't feel. "Lily's expecting us, I promised." In the back, cocooned in her car seat, 7-year-old Lily was humming a nursery rhyme, her small voice a beacon of innocence against the rising fury of the storm. Then came the patch of black ice, the sickening, weightless lurch as the truck lost traction. The world became a maelstrom of spinning white and gray. The horrifying crunch of metal on rock, the shattering of glass. Sarah's sharp, terrified scream. And then the silence. A silence that was so much worse than the noise. A silence where Lily's humming used to be. A strangled cry escaped Aaron's lips. The memory was so vivid, so all-consuming, that he could feel the phantom sting of broken glass on his skin, taste the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. He staggered backward until his back hit the cold stone of the fireplace. He slid down to the floor, pulling his knees to his chest, his body racked with tremors he couldn't control. He was trapped. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging inside his head. He was drowning in it, the icy waters of guilt and loss closing over him. He was dimly aware of another sound in the room, a low, terrified whimpering. Storm, his own trauma triggered by the violent sounds of the blizzard, was scrabbling at the floorboards, trying to find a place to hide from a threat he couldn't see. He squeezed himself under the small wooden table where Aaron ate his meals, his powerful body trembling uncontrollably. But Aaron was lost, adrift in the wreckage of his past. He didn't hear the dog. He heard only the echo of that terrible silence. Storm let out another whimper, this one sharper, more desperate. And somehow, through the deafening roar of his own agony, that small sound pierced through. It was a pinprick of light in an suffocating darkness. It was the sound of a living creature, here, now, who was real and who was terrified. Something inside Aaron shifted. For 5 years, his pain had been the biggest thing in his world, a mountain that blocked out the sun. But in that instant, another's fear became bigger. The protective instinct that had been forged in the crucible of his care for this dog rose up, a powerful, unstoppable wave. Storm was scared, and Storm needed him. It was the most difficult thing he had ever done. He had to fight his own paralyzed muscles, fight the memories that were screaming at him to stay down, to give up. He pushed himself off the floor, his limbs heavy as lead. He crawled on his hands and knees across the wooden floor, each movement a monumental act of will. He reached the table and looked under it. Storm was pressed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. Aaron reached in and laid a trembling hand on the dog's back. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "It's okay. I'm here." He eased himself under the table, curling his body around the dog, shielding him. He wrapped his arms around Storm's shivering frame, pulling him close. The dog resisted for a moment, then sagged against him, burying his head in the crook of Aaron's arm. "We're safe," Aaron murmured, the words as much for himself as for the dog. "It's just noise. The wind can't get us in here. We're safe." He held the dog, rocking back and forth, whispering the same reassurances over and over. He was repeating the words he had been unable to say that night. He was offering the protection he had failed to provide. And in comforting this creature, who had been abandoned to the storm, he was, in some small, unconscious way, comforting the part of himself that had been left behind in the wreckage, the part of him that believed he was unforgivable. He didn't know how long they stayed like that, huddled together in the dark space beneath the table as the blizzard raged outside. But slowly, the violent tremors in his own body began to subside. Storm's shivering lessened, replaced by a deep, shuddering sigh. The roar of the past in Aaron's head began to fade, replaced by the sound of his own heartbeat and the steady, warm breathing of the dog in his arms. He had faced the ghost of his past, and he had not been destroyed. He had reached through his own storm to calm another, and in doing so had found an anchor. He had found the first, fragile moment of forgiveness. The blizzard blew itself out over 2 days, leaving behind a world remade. When Aaron finally opened his cabin door, he was met with a landscape of profound silence and breathtaking beauty. The snow was piled in immense, sculpted drifts, 4 feet deep in most places, burying fences and transforming familiar landmarks into soft, white mounds. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air was so clean and cold it felt like a purifying force. Something had settled inside Aaron, just as the snow had settled upon the land. The terror of the storm had passed, and in its place was a quiet, fragile calm. The shared ordeal had forged a new, deeper bond between him and Storm. They were no longer just a man and a dog sharing a space. They were comrades, survivors who had weathered the same tempest, both inside and out. Life resumed, but with a different quality. The walks were now adventures as they navigated the transformed landscape. Aaron would watch, fascinated, as Storm bounded through the deep powder, his powerful body plowing a path, his gray and white coat a perfect camouflage against the snow. The dog's instincts, long suppressed by injury and fear, were beginning to emerge with a startling clarity. His nose was constantly working, reading the invisible stories left by deer, rabbits, and foxes. He was alert, intelligent, and vibrantly alive. A week after the blizzard, the town's snowplow finally cleared the secondary mountain road, creating towering white canyons on either side. It was a lifeline, but Aaron felt no immediate urge to use it. The quiet solitude no longer felt like a prison. One morning, he decided they needed to walk down to his mailbox at the edge of the main road to check for any mail that might have piled up. It was a 2-mile trek, but the day was bright and the air still. Storm trotted ahead, his tail held high, occasionally looking back to make sure Aaron was following. As they neared the collection of mailboxes that served the few scattered properties on their road, Aaron saw a figure bundled up against the cold. It was Mr. Eugene Wallace, his nearest neighbor, though their cabins were a good mile apart. Mr. Wallace was an elderly man, well into his 80s, who had lived on the mountain his entire life. He was thin and frail, with a stoop in his shoulders that seemed to suggest he was carrying a great, invisible weight. He was meticulously clearing a small path from his own driveway to his mailbox with a small shovel, his movements slow and careful. Aaron gave a nod as they approached. "Morning, Eugene." "Aaron," Mr. Wallace replied, his voice a bit breathless. He paused, leaning on his shovel. "Quite a storm we had." He glanced at Storm, who sat politely at Aaron's side, observing the old man with a calm curiosity. "That's a fine-looking animal you've got there." "He's good company," Aaron said, the simple admission a huge step for him. "Mr." Wallace smiled, a faint gesture that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He reached into the pocket of his thick winter coat. "Time for my medicine," he said, more to himself than to Aaron. As he pulled out a small amber-colored pill bottle, his gloved hand fumbled, and the bottle slipped from his grasp. It happened in slow motion. The tiny plastic cylinder seemed to hang in the air for a moment before disappearing without a sound into the towering soft wall of snow left by the plow. "Oh, no!" Mr. Wallace gasped, his face immediately paling with panic. He dropped his shovel and began to claw frantically at the snowbank. "No, no, no." Aaron stepped forward. "Easy, Eugene. We'll find it." "You don't understand," the old man said, his voice trembling with fear. "That's my heart medication. I need it. I have to take it with breakfast." Aaron understood immediately. The sheer volume of soft, deep snow made the task of finding a tiny pill bottle akin to finding a needle in a haystack. The snow was unstable. Every handful he or Eugene removed caused more to shift and slide, potentially burying the bottle even deeper. They spent 10 minutes searching, their hands growing numb from the cold, their efforts yielding nothing but a growing sense of hopelessness. Mr. Wallace's breathing became ragged, and he had to sit down on his overturned shovel, his face a mask of despair. Aaron stood back, surveying the impossible task. His mind raced, a soldier's mind, trained to assess a problem and find an unconventional solution. And then a memory flickered. It was distant, hazy, from a lifetime ago. A training exercise in a desert country, a demonstration with the canine unit. A handler had hidden a small sealed container of contraband in a vast, sandy field. He had let his dog, a Belgian Malinois, sniff a piece of cloth that had been stored with the same material. Then he had given a single command: find. The memory was so fleeting, so out of context, that he almost dismissed it. He was not a trained handler. Storm was not a trained military dog. He was just a stray he'd found in the woods. It was a foolish, desperate idea. But as he looked at Mr. Wallace's pale, frightened face, and then at Storm, who was watching him intently, his head cocked as if waiting for instructions, he knew he had to try. It was an act born of hope rather than certainty. "Eugene," Aaron said, his voice calm and steady, belying the uncertainty he felt. "I have an idea. It might be nothing, but we have to try. Do you have anything else on you that was in that same pocket? A handkerchief? A glove?" Mr. Wallace looked at him, confused. I have my scarf. It was in there." He pulled a thick woolen scarf from the same pocket. "Let me see it," Aaron said. He took the scarf and knelt in front of Storm. He held the wool to the dog's nose. Storm sniffed it deeply, his nostrils flaring, cataloging the complex blend of scents: wool, laundry detergent, and the faint specific smell of Eugene Wallace himself. Aaron looked Storm directly in the eyes. "Okay, boy," he said, his voice low and focused. "Find it." He swept his hand toward the snowbank. "Go find." For a moment, Storm just looked at him, then at the wall of snow, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. Then something clicked. His instinct, raw and untutored, took over. He approached the snowbank, not with the frantic digging of a human, but with the methodical precision of a predator. He moved along the base of the drift, his nose buried deep in the snow, snorting and sniffing, taking in huge lungfuls of air. He worked his way back and forth, a living sensor array mapping the invisible world of scent. Aaron held his breath. Mr. Wallace watched, his mouth slightly agape. Suddenly, Storm stopped. He became rigid, his focus locked on a single spot about 3 feet up the snowbank. He sniffed it once more, deeply, then began to dig, not with his paws, but with his nose, pushing and rooting with an incredible intensity. A second later, he pulled his head back and held carefully between his soft lips was the small amber pill bottle. He trotted back to Aaron, his tail giving a proud, sweeping wag, and gently dropped the bottle into Aaron's outstretched hand. The silence that followed was broken only by a choked sob from Mr. Wallace. "I don't believe it," he whispered, tears freezing on his wrinkled cheeks as Aaron handed him the bottle. "I just don't believe it. He found it." "Good boy, Storm," Aaron said, his voice thick with emotion as he buried his hands in the dog's thick fur, scratching him behind the ears. "What a good boy." The walk back to the cabin was different. The world seemed sharper, more vibrant. Aaron kept looking down at Storm, who trotted beside him with a new sense of pride. The event had been more than just a lucky break. It was a revelation. He had looked at this dog and seen a fellow survivor, a companion in his solitude. But now he saw something more. He saw a purpose. He saw an incredible, innate ability that had been lying dormant, waiting for a chance to emerge. The act of finding the bottle hadn't just saved Mr. Wallace from a medical emergency. It had planted a seed of a new idea in Aaron's mind, a question that began to echo in the quiet spaces of his thoughts. Perhaps their survival, his and Storm's, wasn't just about enduring the quiet ache of the past. Perhaps it was meant for something more. Perhaps together they could do more than just survive. Perhaps they could save others too. News in a small, isolated town like Aspen Ridge travels not on the wind, but on a current of shared experience, flowing from the general store to the post office to the lone gas station. The story of Eugene Wallace's lost medicine and the incredible dog who found it became the talk of the town within a day. It was a simple, good-hearted story, a welcome reprieve from the usual talk of harsh weather and economic struggles. And it had two unlikely heroes, the reclusive veteran on the mountain and his mysterious gray dog. Aaron was oblivious to his newfound minor fame. He remained in his self-imposed sanctuary, the seed of purpose planted by the incident with Mr. Wallace slowly, tentatively taking root. He found himself watching Storm in a new light, not just as a companion, but as a creature of astounding capability. He began to devise small games to test the dog's intelligence and nose. He would hide one of Storm's favorite pine cones under a snowdrift in the yard, and with a simple command of "find it," watch in awe as the dog unerringly located it within seconds. Each success was a quiet thrill, a confirmation of the incredible instinct that lay beneath Storm's calm demeanor. A week later, Aaron finally managed to dig his truck out of the ditch, the engine starting with a familiar, comforting rumble. The need for more of the specialized dog food he'd bought, along with his own dwindling supplies, forced a trip back into town. As he drove down the mountain, he felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the reflexive bracing for the casual, unintentional scrutiny of other people. But this time, something was different. As he passed a beat-up pickup truck going the other way, the driver, a local rancher whose face he vaguely recognized, lifted a hand from his steering wheel in a clear, deliberate wave. Aaron was so surprised he almost didn't react, managing only a stiff, short nod in return. At the general store, the young woman behind the counter, who usually treated him with a detached, professional curtness, offered him a small, genuine smile. "I hear your dog did something pretty amazing for old Mr. Wallace," she said, her voice friendly. Aaron was taken aback. He wasn't prepared for conversation. "He's a good dog," he mumbled, placing his items on the counter, his gaze fixed on the worn wood grain. "Sounds like it," she said, undeterred. "Eugene was telling everyone. Said you two were a real blessing." Aaron paid, gathered his bags, and left without another word, his heart hammering in his chest. The interaction was minor, a fleeting moment of small-town kindness. But for a man who had spent 5 years making himself invisible, it felt like being thrust under a spotlight. On the drive home, however, the initial discomfort gave way to a different feeling. The wave, the smile, the kind words, they weren't invasive. They were acknowledgments. They weren't seeing the broken recluse. They were seeing the man with the remarkable dog. They were seeing him for the first time as a part of the community, not apart from it. A few days later, he saw a familiar figure making her way up the path to his cabin. It was Martha Hayes, moving with the steady, unhurried gait of someone who has spent a lifetime on uneven terrain. She carried a small canvas bag. Storm, who had been lying on the porch, let out a single, low woof, not of aggression, but of announcement, his tail giving a slow, curious wag. "Just thought I'd check on your patient," Martha said as she approached, her sharp eyes taking in Storm's now barely perceptible limp. "Looks like your battlefield medicine did the trick. He's looking strong." "He's a fast healer," Aaron replied, remaining on the porch, a silent but clear barrier. Martha seemed to understand. She didn't try to come closer. She just leaned against the porch railing, her gaze sweeping over the vast, snow-covered valley below. "Eugene Wallace is quite the storyteller," she said casually. "The whole town is buzzing. Sounds like you two have a special bond." Aaron just nodded, scratching Storm behind the ears. "A dog with a nose like that is a rare thing," Martha continued, her tone thoughtful. "And a man who knows how to trust it is even rarer." She paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment, punctuated only by the distant caw of a raven. "You know," she said, finally turning her gaze to meet his. "The county search and rescue team is always looking for volunteers, especially canine teams. It's tough work, unforgiving. But up here, in these mountains, they save lives, Aaron." The words hit him with an unexpected force. It was the one thing he had been thinking about, the one possibility he had allowed to flicker in the back of his mind, and hearing it said aloud made it terrifyingly real. All his defenses went up at once. "I'm not a hero, Martha," he said, his voice flat and hard. "And he's not a trained rescue dog. He's just a stray I found." "I'm not talking about heroes," she said, her voice gentle but firm, cutting through his defensive wall. "I'm talking about purpose. Sometimes the things that wound us the deepest are the very things that give us the strength to help others. You've seen the worst the world can do. You've survived it. That's not a weakness. It's a tool. It gives you an understanding, a steadiness that most people don't have. And that dog, he trusts you implicitly. A bond like that can move mountains, or at least find people who are lost on them." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded pamphlet. "No pressure," she said, placing it on the porch railing. "Just something to think about." With that, she gave him a small, knowing smile, gave Storm a final appreciative look, and turned to walk back down the path. Aaron stood there for a long time after she was gone, the pamphlet lying on the railing like a challenge. He didn't touch it. He went inside, the familiar walls of his cabin feeling smaller, more confining than before. Martha's words echoed in his head. Sometimes the things that wound us the deepest are the very things that give us the strength to help others. He rejected the idea. It was absurd. How could his failure, his all-consuming guilt, possibly be a source of strength? The thought of putting himself and Storm in another life-or-death situation, of being responsible for someone else's life in the heart of a storm, was enough to make him physically ill. It was too close to the memory, too close to the failure he could never outrun. But later that night, long after the moon had risen over the silent, snow-covered peaks, he found himself unable to sleep. The cabin was quiet, Storm breathing softly at the foot of his bed. The seed of purpose, which had been a fragile, hopeful thing, was now a source of inner turmoil. He got up and walked over to the desk where his old laptop sat gathering dust. He powered it on, the machine whirring to life in the darkness. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. He wasn't ready. He was terrified. But for the first time in 5 years, his fear was being challenged by a different emotion, a daring, fragile flicker of hope. He took a deep breath and with a hand that was not quite steady, he typed the words into the search bar. Canine Search and Rescue Training, Colorado. The act of typing those words into the search bar had felt like stepping off a cliff. In the days that followed, Aaron existed in the terrifying, weightless space of free fall. He spent hours reading, devouring information on training methodologies, scent theory, and the rigorous certification standards for canine teams. He learned about the different disciplines: tracking, trailing, air scent, avalanche rescue. Each article, each training video was a revelation. He saw Storm's natural behaviors reflected in the descriptions of elite working dogs. The way he used the wind, the intensity of his focus, the clear joy he took in the simple act of finding something. This new knowledge was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it filled him with a thrilling, dangerous sense of possibility. He began to incorporate basic scent games into their daily routine, using old T-shirts and hiding them in increasingly difficult locations around the property. Storm excelled, his success rate a constant, staggering affirmation of his innate talent. The dog seemed to come alive during these games, his entire being focused with a joyful intensity that was infectious. On the other hand, the more Aaron learned, the more the crushing weight of responsibility settled on him. This was not a game. The dogs in the videos were finding real people, often in the worst moments of their lives. The handlers were calm, competent figures who moved with a quiet authority that Aaron felt he had lost forever. The thought of placing himself and Storm in that position, where a mistake could mean the difference between life and death, was a cold knot of dread in his stomach. Hope and fear were at war within him, and he was the battlefield. The decision was made for him on a gray, heavy afternoon 2 weeks later. The weather had been unstable all day, a nervous energy in the air that put both man and dog on edge. A new storm was forecast, but the predictions were erratic. Some models called for a few inches of snow, others for a major blizzard. The uncertainty was a mirror of Aaron's own inner state. He was outside, splitting the last of a large pine round, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a familiar meditation. Storm was lying on the porch, his head on his paws, but his eyes were open and alert, tracking the movement of the scudding, dark-bellied clouds. Suddenly, the emergency broadcast tone blared from the weather radio inside the cabin, a harsh, electronic screech that cut through the mountain silence. Aaron's blood ran cold. He dropped the axe and strode quickly inside, Storm at his heels. He reached the radio just as the automated voice gave way to a live announcer from the county's emergency broadcast network. "We are issuing an urgent winter storm warning for all high-elevation areas of Aspen Ridge and the surrounding backcountry," the voice said, strained with urgency. "Conditions are deteriorating much more rapidly than anticipated. A fast-moving blizzard is descending on the region, with expected snowfall of 2 to 3 feet and wind gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour. All residents are advised to shelter in place. All mountain passes are now considered impassable." The announcer paused, and the next words made the air in the cabin feel thin and sharp. "This warning is now coupled with a missing person alert. The Aspen Ridge Sheriff's Department is asking for any information regarding the whereabouts of Noah Sullivan, age 15. Aaron froze, his hand resting on the table beside the radio. Noah, the sullen, unhappy boy from the general store. "The teen was last seen approximately 3 hours ago," the announcer continued, his voice grim. "He was reportedly heading toward the backcountry trails near Whisper Creek Pass for snowboarding. He is believed to be wearing a black jacket and orange pants. It has been reported that the boy left his home after a family argument. Anyone with information is urged to contact the Sheriff's Department immediately. Search and rescue operations are being mobilized, but efforts are severely hampered by the extreme weather conditions." The broadcast began to repeat the warning, but Aaron no longer heard it. He heard only 2 words: Whisper Creek Pass. The name was a key, unlocking a door in his mind that he had spent 5 years sealing shut with routine and isolation. Behind that door was the night of the accident. Whisper Creek Pass was the treacherous, winding stretch of road where his truck had hit the ice, where his life had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. It was the place he had never returned to, a ghost on his mental map that he avoided at all costs. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. The cabin, his fortress, suddenly felt like a cage, the walls closing in. He could hear the wind beginning to rise outside, its voice a low, familiar moan that spoke directly to his trauma. He sank into a chair, his mind a chaotic whirl of images. Noah's frustrated face in the parking lot, the sickening lurch of his own truck spinning out of control, the blinding white of the snow, the silence. He thought of the boy's parents, the weary kindness in the father's eyes, the strained patience on the mother's face. He could imagine their terror now, an agony that was a visceral, living thing inside his own body. He knew that agony. He lived with its ghost every single day. He stood up and began to pace, a caged animal. His mind screamed at him to block it out. This wasn't his fight. He was not a rescuer. He was a wreck, a man held together with scar tissue and solitude. To go out there, into that specific place, in that specific weather, was to willingly walk back into the heart of his own personal hell. It would destroy him. The fragile peace he had built, the tenuous connection he had forged with Storm, would be obliterated by the ghosts waiting for him on that pass. He stopped, his gaze falling on Storm. The dog was sitting, watching him, his head tilted. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a deep, unwavering attention. He saw the tension in Aaron, the panic, and he let out a low, soft whine, a sound of profound concern. Aaron looked at the dog, and then he looked through the window at the swirling, thickening snow. Martha's words came back to him, unbidden. A bond like that can move mountains, or at least find people who are lost on them. He knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute that Storm could do this. He knew that if he took one of Noah's sweatshirts, Storm could follow the boy's trail through the snow. He knew that the dog's powerful nose and unwavering drive could succeed where a team of humans, blinded by the blizzard, might fail. The knowledge was a terrible burden. It presented him with a choice, stark and unavoidable. He could stay here, in the relative safety of his cabin, and listen to the radio reports, a passive, helpless bystander. He could protect himself, preserve the fragile sanity he had clawed back from the abyss. Or he could face the ghosts. He could walk into the heart of his trauma, into the maw of the storm, and use his pain, his knowledge of that treacherous terrain, and the incredible gift that was the dog beside him, to try and save the life of a boy he barely knew. It was a choice between continuing to run from the past or turning to face it in the service of another. It was a choice between survival and salvation. He stood by the window, watching the blizzard consume the world, his reflection a pale, haunted face in the glass. Outside, the storm raged, and inside, a battle just as fierce was being fought, for the life of Noah Sullivan and for the soul of Aaron Blake. The battle was lost before it had truly begun. The part of him that screamed for self-preservation, that clawed for the safety of his four walls, was no match for the image of a mother's strained face and the visceral, soul-deep memory of what it felt like to be a parent terrified for their child. He could not live with himself if he did nothing. Survival was no longer enough. But the moment the decision was made, the full force of his trauma crashed down upon him. His legs gave out, and he found himself on the floor, his back against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. The howl of the wind outside was no longer just wind. It was the sound of tearing metal, of a life being ripped apart. The swirling snow in the window was the last thing he saw before the world went black, the last thing he saw before the impact. He was back there. The cold was a living thing, seeping through the broken driver's side window, carrying the scent of pine and gasoline. He tried to turn, to check on Sarah, to call out for Lily, but his body wouldn't respond. A thick, syrupy slowness had taken hold of him. He could hear a faint, rhythmic dripping. Blood. His blood. He could feel something warm and wet matting his hair. He remembered thinking, with a strange clinical detachment, that he needed to stay awake. He was the one who was supposed to protect them. He had promised. A wet, rough pressure against his hand broke through the phantom cold. Then a low whine, a sound saturated with concern, cut through the imagined silence. Aaron's eyes flew open. He wasn't in the twisted metal of his truck. He was on the floor of his cabin. The wind was real, the snow was real, and the dog in front of him was real. Storm had pushed his wet nose insistently into Aaron's clenched fist, forcing the fingers open. Now he laid his heavy head on Aaron's knee, his entire body a warm, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of Aaron's mind. He looked up at Aaron, not with pity, but with a profound, unwavering trust. His eyes said, "I am here. What are we doing next?" That simple, unspoken question was the hand that pulled Aaron from the drowning depths. He looked at Storm, at this creature of instinct and loyalty, and the crushing weight of his solitude lifted just for a moment. He was not alone this time. He had a partner. That single thought was enough to clear the fog. He had to move. Now. He pushed himself to his feet, his movements stiff but purposeful. He grabbed his phone, his thumb hovering over the keypad. He didn't have the Sullivans' number, and he couldn't imagine calling the sheriff's department and trying to explain his insane plan. There was only one person who would understand, who wouldn't waste time with questions. He dialed Martha's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm as ever. "Aaron?" "It's me," he said, his voice rough. "Noah Sullivan. I'm going after him." There was a pause, but not of surprise. It was a pause of understanding. "The pass is a death trap in this weather, Aaron. The official team is trying to stage at the base, but they can't even see 10 feet in front of them." "I know the pass," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Better than anyone. And Storm, he can do this, Martha, but I need a scent article, something the boy wore, something that hasn't been washed." "The Sullivans are at the community hall with the sheriff," she said, her voice already shifting into a practical, no-nonsense tone. "I'll call them now. I'll meet you at the trailhead at the bottom of the pass. You'll have to get there on foot. No truck will make it." "I'm on my way," he said, and hung up. The next 10 minutes were a blur of focused, disciplined action, a ritual that pushed the panic back down. He pulled on his best thermal gear, layers of wool and weatherproof fabrics. He strapped on heavy-duty snowshoes. He filled a thermos with hot, sweet tea. He grabbed a high-powered flashlight, a medical kit, and a compact emergency shovel, packing it all into a worn military-grade backpack. Throughout it all, Storm was a silent shadow, watching his every move, his body vibrating with a focused energy, as if he understood the gravity of their mission. "Ready, boy?" Aaron asked, clipping a long lead onto Storm's collar. The dog responded with a single, sharp bark. Stepping out into the blizzard was like stepping onto another planet. The wind hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into any exposed patch of skin. Visibility was non-existent, a churning, disorienting vortex of white. But this time, he was not a victim of the storm. He was an adversary. The journey down to the trailhead was a brutal fight against the elements. But it was more than that. It was a pilgrimage. Every step took him closer to the source of his pain, the geographical heart of his trauma. The landscape was a ghost, every tree, every rock, a potential trigger for a memory he had to force back down. He focused on Storm, on the steady pull of the leash in his hand, on the dog's powerful form plowing a path ahead of him. Storm was his compass, not just in the physical world, but in the treacherous terrain of his own mind. He met Martha near the closed gate at the bottom of the pass. She was a small, indomitable figure huddled in the cab of her idling Jeep, the headlights cutting a weak yellow swath through the blizzard. She rolled down the window and handed him a plastic-sealed bag. Inside was a gray hooded sweatshirt. "His parents send their prayers," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "The sheriff thinks you're crazy, but I told him he's never seen a bond like yours." "Tell them we'll find him," Aaron said, a promise he had no right to make, but one he had to believe. He knelt in the meager shelter of the Jeep, opened the bag, and held the sweatshirt to Storm's nose. "Noah," he said, his voice firm and clear over the howl of the wind. Find Noah. Storm sniffed the garment, his entire body locking into a state of intense concentration. He lifted his head, tasting the wind, his ears swiveling. Then, with a low growl of determination, he began to pull, leading them past the gate and into the heart of Whisper Creek Pass. They moved into the tempest, man and dog, a single entity against the fury of the storm. This was no longer just a search for a lost boy. It was an act of redemption. Aaron was walking back into the wreckage of his life, but this time, he was not a victim. He was a rescuer. This time, he was not alone. They climbed for what felt like hours, the wind a constant screaming torment. Aaron's muscles burned and his lungs ached from the frigid air. He relied completely on Storm, who moved with a relentless, unwavering purpose, his nose to the ground, following a trail that was utterly invisible to human eyes. They were nearing the sharp hairpin curve, the curve when Storm's behavior changed. He stopped, lifting his head, sniffing the air with a new urgency. He veered sharply off the road, pulling Aaron up a steep, wooded embankment. This was the place. The ghosts were screaming at him now, but Storm's insistent pull was stronger. At the top of the embankment, the ground leveled out onto a small, wind-scoured plateau. And there, Aaron saw it. A wide, unnatural scar in the snowpack. A slide. Not a massive avalanche, but a small, localized slab that had broken free from the cornice above. And sticking out of the snow, like a broken bone, was the tip of a snowboard. Storm began to dig, his paws tearing at the densely packed snow with a desperate, frantic energy. "I'm coming, Noah!" Aaron yelled into the wind, the sound swallowed by the storm. He dropped his pack, grabbed his shovel, and joined the dog. The physical act was a release, a channeling of 5 years of pent-up grief and guilt and rage into a single, life-affirming purpose. He was not digging into a grave of memory. He was digging toward a chance at life. He was unearthing not just a boy, but a part of himself he thought had been buried forever on that cold, dark night. Man and dog, they dug together, a single, desperate torch against the overwhelming darkness of the storm. Time dissolved into a frantic, rhythmic blur of motion and sound, the scrape of Aaron's shovel against the dense, icy snow, the desperate panting of Storm digging beside him, and the relentless, deafening roar of the wind. Aaron's muscles screamed in protest, his lungs burned with every frigid breath, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He was driven by a force more powerful than exhaustion, a primal need to pull life back from the brink. His shovel struck something soft. "I've got him!" he yelled, though there was no one but Storm to hear. He dropped the shovel and began to dig with his bare hands, tearing away the heavy snow with a desperate urgency. First, he uncovered the bright orange fabric of a pant leg, then the black of a jacket, and finally, a pale, still face, framed by the hood of a sweatshirt, eyes closed, lips blue. Noah. Aaron's training surged to the forefront, a calm, clear voice cutting through the storm of his emotions. He pressed 2 fingers against the boy's neck, under the jawline, searching for a pulse. For a terrifying, eternal second, there was nothing. Then he felt it. Faint, thready, and dangerously slow. But it was there. A heartbeat. "He's alive!" Aaron shouted, a raw, triumphant cry that was ripped away by the wind. "He's alive, Storm!" The dog, sensing the shift, stopped digging and began to bark, a series of sharp, loud barks that cut through the blizzard's howl with an astonishing clarity. Aaron worked quickly, his movements sure and practiced. He cleared the snow from Noah's chest and mouth, checking his airway. The boy was unconscious, likely from a combination of a head injury and severe hypothermia. Aaron could see that one of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle, a clear sign of a fracture. He carefully uncovered the rest of the boy's body. He had been lucky. The small slide had created an air pocket around his upper body, which had likely saved him from suffocation. He unstrapped his backpack, his mind a checklist of emergency procedures. He pulled out the thermal blanket and a spare wool sweater, wrapping them tightly around Noah's torso to prevent further heat loss. He couldn't move the boy because of the leg injury, and he couldn't start a fire in these conditions. His only hope was to stabilize him and get help. Fast. He pulled out his phone, his heart sinking as he saw the single, flickering bar of service. It was a miracle there was any signal at all this high up in a blizzard. He dialed Martha's number, praying it would connect. "Aaron!" Her voice was tinny, breaking up. "I've got him!" he yelled over the wind. "He's alive, but it's bad. He's hypothermic, unconscious, broken leg. I'm on the plateau, just above the hairpin curve on Whisper Creek Pass. I've stabilized him, but he won't last long out here." "Stay on the line if you can," Martha's voice crackled back. "I'm with the sheriff. I'm relaying your position now. The SR team is on their way up, but they're moving blind. Can you give them a signal?" "Storm is barking," he said. "Tell them to listen for the dog." The line went dead. All he could do now was wait. He knelt beside Noah, shielding the boy's still form with his own body. Storm, as if understanding the new mission, moved to the edge of the plateau and continued to bark, a steady, rhythmic beacon in the whiteout. It felt like a lifetime. Aaron kept checking Noah's pulse, murmuring words of encouragement to the unconscious boy. He was no longer just a stranger. He was a life, a precious, fragile life that Aaron was now responsible for. And as he knelt there, in the heart of the storm, at the very site of his greatest failure, a profound sense of peace settled over him. The ghosts were still there, but they were silent. They had no power over him now. He had faced them, and he had won. A new sound began to cut through the wind, the crunch of snowshoes, the faint shouts of human voices. A beam of a powerful flashlight sliced through the blizzard, and then another. A team of 4 figures in bright orange search and rescue jackets emerged from the swirling snow, drawn by the sound of Storm's unwavering barks. The lead rescuer, a man with a weathered, competent face, knelt beside him. "You did good," he said, his voice full of respect as his team immediately went to work, loading Noah onto a specialized rescue sled. "We never would have found him without that dog." The journey back down the mountain was a blur. The SR team was efficient and professional, a well-oiled machine. Aaron and Storm followed behind, no longer the leaders of the rescue, but its silent, exhausted instigators. They brought Noah directly to the community hall, which had been turned into a makeshift command center. The moment they entered the warm, brightly lit room, a woman screamed. It was Noah's mother, her face a mess of tears and terror. She and her husband rushed to the sled, their hands reaching for their son. A team of paramedics took over, and in the organized chaos, Aaron and Storm stood by the door, forgotten. But then Noah's father looked up, his eyes finding Aaron's across the room. He walked over, his face etched with an emotion so profound it was almost painful to witness. He didn't say anything. He just pulled Aaron into a fierce, desperate hug. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with sobs. "You saved our boy. You saved our family." Aaron stood stiffly for a moment, then slowly he returned the embrace. He felt the man's gratitude, a powerful healing wave that washed over the barren shores of his soul. The weeks that followed were a slow, gentle sunrise. The story of the rescue became a local legend, a tale of hope and courage told and retold in the general store and at the post office. Aaron and Storm were no longer the reclusive veteran and his mysterious dog. They were heroes. The change was palpable. People smiled at him in town, waved as he drove by. The Sullivans brought a home-baked pie up to his cabin, and Noah, his leg in a cast but his eyes full of a newfound respect, shook his hand and said, "Thank you." Each small act of kindness was a stitch, mending the torn fabric of Aaron's connection to the world. He realized Martha had been right. His scars, his intimate knowledge of grief and survival, were not a weakness. They were his strength. He could not change the past. He could not bring back his wife and daughter, but he could use the man that tragedy had forged to shape a new future, a future with meaning. One crisp, clear morning in early spring, Aaron Blake drove down to the Aspen Ridge Community Hall. Storm sat in the passenger seat, his head held high, his ears alert. A large banner hung over the door. Aspen Ridge Volunteer Search and Rescue, New Member Orientation. He walked inside, not as an outsider, but as a participant. He saw the faces of the rescuers who had met him on the mountain, the sheriff and other volunteers from the community. He saw Martha Hayes, who gave him a proud, welcoming smile. They were gathered in a circle, a team, a family forged by the harsh beauty of the mountains and a shared commitment to help those in need. Aaron took his place among them, Storm sitting dutifully at his side. He had found a new mission. He had found a new peace. He had found a new home, a community that had been waiting patiently for him to find his way back from the storm. The instructor began to speak, and as Aaron listened, a genuine, unburdened smile touched his lips. The sun was rising on the summit, and for the first time in a very long time, he was ready to face the day. The story of Aaron and Storm reminds us that sometimes our deepest wounds are not the end of our story, but the beginning of our true purpose. It is a quiet testament to the healing power of loyalty and the courage it takes to face a new dawn. If their journey has touched your heart, sharing it through a like or a comment helps bring this message of hope to others. We are grateful for every subscription that helps our community grow. To continue the journey with another tale of an unbreakable bond, please click on the video that is now on your screen. Thank you for listening.